Morning, folks. And today I'm going to talk about Formula One and the guy who really brought Formula One to where it is today, a guy called Bernie Ecclestone. I'm doing this because the Formula One season has just started, or has in the last few weeks anyway. Drive to Survive Season 7 dropped a few weeks ago. And outside of rugby, which is my favourite sport, Formula One is my second favourite sport. I've been a big fan since about 1990 onwards, or even a bit earlier. So, who is Bernie Ecclestone? Well, Formula One legend Eddie Jordan once summed up Bernie's business acumen with the following line that I love. He says, "Anyone who has had a business, sold it 4 times, has never bought it back, has never lost its control, and still owns it is pretty special. And you know the most important thing? He never fucking owned it in the first place." Excuse the French, but those are Eddie's words. So this was Bernie Ecclestone, this London wheeler dealer with a mop of grey hair, usually wearing shades, standing just 5 foot 2.5 inches, but carrying himself around the paddocks with a real presence. And he seemed to revel in his small stature. I remember watching Formula One in the 90s and the 2000s. And you'd see Bernie strutting around the paddocks with his stunning 6'1" wife usually by his side, and nervous journalists would be scrambling after him to get a word. And oftentimes he had this habit of ending conversations with a light slap on the cheek, like a mafia don, a kind of reminder, a signal to let them know who was really in charge. He was a master negotiator, and he built Formula One into this global juggernaut that it is today. And of course, he made billions for himself in the process. He transformed the sport, and he also, though, left this trail of controversy in his wake. He made a lot of powerful enemies. He found himself in court more than once, and all of this makes for a fantastic story. He was born in 1930. His father was a trawler captain, and he left school at 15 because Bernie was money mad. Now, this is straight after the war, and it was a time where machinery and vehicles were very scarce, and Bernie saw the opportunity. He began going through all the newspapers, travelling across southeast London in search of bike parts that he could buy and sell. And he said himself, this kind of hustle taught him the value of everything. And it really cemented his love for the deal, especially when he came out on top. And Bernie, as we shall see, always came out on top of the deal. He was a master negotiator. Now, his business instincts led him to get into business with a local motorbike shop owner called Fred Compton, and they established Compton and Ecclestone. Before long, though, however, Bernie bought out Fred's stake and took full control, and under his leadership, Compton and Ecclestone became one of Britain's biggest motorcycle dealerships, and Ecclestone became a key player in London's trade scene. He had a rare ability, or legend has it anyway, he had this rare ability to walk into a showroom and price everything at a glance. And they said that his deals were often so complex that the guy on the other side of the trade often wouldn't realise until they were halfway home that they had ended up with something they didn't really want. That was key to Bernie's negotiating style. He made it very complex, and he always knew the details. Now, through the 1950s, Ecclestone really aggressively expanded his business. He snapped up neighbouring car dealerships and used car lots around London, and he transformed them into these very, very stylish showrooms. He also moved into real estate, financing ventures, and by his 20s, he was a very, very wealthy man. Now, as we shall see, Bernie often strayed into legal, dubious territory. When he sold the motorcycle dealership, he pocketed around £10,000 that was to go to the taxman, and of course he was brought to court and he had to give the money back. But what's interesting is that a judge described Ecclestone's financial manoeuvrings as altogether extraordinary, and he also questioned Ecclestone's credibility as a witness. Ecclestone's real passion was motor racing, and he got into driving early on. He bought a Cooper 500cc Formula 3 car, But a bad crash at Brands Hatch saw his car hit another car, leave the track and actually end up in a nearby parking lot. And while he wasn't badly injured at all, he realised that he was, as he said himself, better at doing deals than driving. And so he got into the business side of motor racing. He started off by managing a promising 27-year-old driver named Stuart Lewis Evans. But Lewis Evans tragically was involved in a big crash in the Morocco Grand Prix in 1958, and he suffered catastrophic burns, and he died a few days afterwards. Apparently the loss devastated Ecclestone, and he withdrew from the sport and spent much of the early 60s on the sidelines and on his business ventures. But by the mid-1960s he got back into it, managing a young Austrian driver named Jochen Rindt. Now Rindt was known for being brash, supremely talented, and confident, they say, to the point of arrogance. And it was all these characteristics that appealed to Ecclestone. And Rindt did deliver on his promise. By 1970 Formula 1 Championship, he had won 5 races and had built up a big lead in the championship table. But then at Monza, high-speed crash, Rindt died instantly. Now, he would go on to win the title posthumously, the only ever driver to do so, but Bernie was shattered. Witnesses recall seeing Bernie carrying Rindt's helmet away from the wreckage, crying. And he reportedly swore that he would never ever get close to drivers again. And I would say that's probably true, because I think from that moment onwards he viewed them not as friends but as commodities. And that might seem a bit harsh, but when you look at it, you might think that, after losing 2 drivers in such brutal fashion, that Ecclestone would turn into an advocate for safety in Formula 1. But he did the exact opposite. Throughout his career, Bernie kind of fought against increasing safety measures. He argued that danger was part of Formula 1's allure, and that, without it, the sport's popularity and revenue would suffer. And as a sports fan, I kind of get where he's coming from. I mean, the crashes are a thrilling part of sport, but nobody wants to see a driver get injured or even killed. I'm all on for the thrill of Formula 1, but I'm also all on for having safety measures in place so that these young, talented drivers, aren't killed. But Bernie saw it differently. Now, in late 71, Bernie made his next big move into Formula 1. This is when he bought the Brabham team, Formula 1 team, for around £100,000, and he assembled a team of very, very talented engineers, and by 1974-75 they were winning races, and their success continued into the 80s. With Nelson Piquet as their driver, they won the 81 and 83 championship. So huge success. But in the mid-80s, key personnel were going, and Ecclestone was increasingly focused on the business side of Formula 1 that we're going to get into. So Brabham's performance declined, and in 1988 he sold the team for $13.5 million. Now, he bought it for $100,000 17 years earlier, so that was a good return on investment. But just to put that $13.5 million in perspective, today the average cost of a Formula 1 team is $2 billion. So that'll show you how far Formula 1 has come over the last 35 years or so. And a lot of that is down to Bernie. So what happened was, by the 1970s, Formula 1 teams were really in a very lopsided position financially, because the race organisers and the governing body, which was and is the FIA, it stands for the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile, which is this organisation. Back then it was perceived as a stuffy, gentleman's type club with little or no commercial savvy. They controlled the bulk of the revenues from Formula 1, and the teams really struggled financially and kind of got the scraps of whatever the FIA and the race promoters decided to give them. So they were living off meagre sponsorships. So by 1974, this prompted the team owners to form the Formula 1 Constructors Association, or FOCA. And Ecclestone was heavily involved, and of course he had this reputation and this experience as a hard-nosed negotiator, and so he emerged as a key power broker within FOCA, and by 1978 he had become its CEO. And under his leadership, FOCA began to aggressively negotiate better terms for the teams, and this of course led to a standoff with the FIA. At one point, FOCA even threatened to break away entirely, announcing the formation of a rival series called the World Professional Drivers' Championship in late 1980. But eventually, in 1981, after a tense 13-hour negotiating meeting at the FIA's headquarters in Place de la Concorde, they reached an historic resolution, which became known as the Concorde Agreement. Now, this was a landmark moment, not just for Formula One, but also for Bernie, because it resulted in a fairer distribution of revenue. But the most crucial victory for Ecclestone came with the control of the television rights. As part of the deal, FOCA now had the authority to negotiate Formula One's television contracts. Most interestingly, FOCA, which remember, had Bernie as its CEO, they leased the TV rights to a new company that Bernie had set up and owned, called Formula One Promotions and Administration, or FOPA. I know there's a lot of acronyms, I'll try and keep it as simple as possible. So this was the new organisation that was going to sit between the FIA and the team owners organisation called FOCA. And Bernie was now in charge of this organisation, and now Bernie really capitalised on this control that he had, because he transformed Grand Prix racing into a really, really profitable and marketable TV spectacle. So he invested in dedicated broadcast infrastructure. He introduced onboard cameras. He negotiated global TV packages, because up to then, TV stations would buy maybe one or two races. Now they bought the whole season, and the impact was immediate. Throughout the 1980s, Formula One's television audience, it expanded massively across Europe and beyond. And of course, this resulted in a surge in sponsorship value and fan engagement. Now, by 1987, Bernie had secured a second Concorde Agreement, one that again further tilted the financial structure in favour of his company. To give you an idea of the breakdown, so under this new agreement, television revenues were split three ways: 47% to the teams, 30% to the FIA, and 23% to Ecclestone's company, FOPA, Formula One Promotions and Administration. Now, just think about that. 47% to the teams. This is back in the late 80s. In the late 80s, early 90s, there was more than 10 teams. There was maybe, 18 or 19 teams at some stages. They had to split the 47% between them all. Bernie got 23%, all to himself. But the teams were happy for a while, because Formula One's revenue skyrocketed. Trackside advertising became another goldmine, because Ecclestone's friend, Paddy McNally, through his company All Sport Management, Paddy McNally, an Irishman of course, he developed this unified system for selling signage around circuits. And then Ecclestone ensured that every aspect of television production was optimised to highlight the sponsors. So from trackside billboards to the podium backdrops, and of course this maximised the commercial potential of each race. McNally also introduced another innovation which was called the Paddock Club. And this was a high-end corporate hospitality experience. And of course it redefined luxury in Formula One. And it allowed Bernie to earn even more money from the top sponsors, because they were only too happy to pay for this corporate hospitality. By the mid-90s, Ecclestone struck a new deal with the FIA. Now, what's important here is that by this stage, Max Mosley, who was a key legal advisor to Bernie back in Bernie's FOCA days, and also when Bernie set up his new company, so Max now was in charge of the FIA. He was the president of the FIA. And in 1995, the FIA and Bernie's company agreed to transfer all Formula One commercial rights from FOCA, that was the team organisation, to Ecclestone's company. It was a 14-year lease, and it cost Bernie just $10 million per year. Now, again, to put that into perspective, at that time, Ecclestone's company was generating over $90 million in profits annually. This was a huge coup. I mean, in 1996 alone, Ecclestone's company paid him a personal salary of $83 million. In effect, Ecclestone and Mosley had orchestrated this move where the team's collective rights were secretly sold back to Ecclestone himself. Now, the teams had to sign off on this, And initially they just balked, but Ecclestone had too much leverage. And he also used his usual negotiating tactic of divide and conquer. And one by one, he picked off the teams, got them to sign, and he cemented his control over the sport's financial future. Now, by the late 1990s, Formula One was valued in the billions, and Bernie initially considered doing an IPO, but instead he opted for private sales. He sold 50% of Formula One to German media company EM.TV in 1999 for approximately $1.65 billion. And the following year, he sold another 25% to the Kirch Group for $1 billion, all the while he stayed in charge, of course. Now, EMTV ran into financial trouble. Kirch Media stepped in and they bought their 50%, so effectively Kirch Media now had 75%. But things took a turn in 2002 when Kirch Media went bankrupt, and its 75% stake in Formula One ended up in the hands of three banks: a German bank, Lehman Brothers, and JP Morgan. And, while technically now they owned a majority of the business, they quickly realised that Ecclestone had stacked the board with loyalists, and these loyalists were blocking them from exercising control. So, of course, the banks took him to court and argued that Ecclestone was preventing them from managing their own assets. Bernie, of course, lost the case. And to many observers, this looked like the end of Ecclestone's reign as the Formula One supremo. But you underestimate Bernie at your peril, because he always had a knack for finding a way out of tricky situations. Behind the scenes, he was courting new investors, looking for somebody to buy out the banks, while also an investor that would keep him firmly in place as Formula One's leader. And an investor emerged in 2006 when private equity firm CVC Capital Partners agreed to acquire the bank's 75% stake in a deal valued at around $2 billion. And they also bought, I think, a small share of Bernie's stake. And of course, CVC had no interest in micromanaging the business. That's the reason why Bernie courted them. And they retained Ecclestone as CEO and gave him free rein to continue running the sport as he saw fit. Now, years later, this deal sparked a huge controversy and criminal case because a German banker named Gerhard Gebrkowski, he admitted to receiving a $44 million payment from Ecclestone during negotiations. This was effectively a bribe to ensure that CVC's bid was favoured because, of course, CVC was going to keep Bernie in control. And in 2013, Bernie was indicted on criminal bribery charges. Now, unfortunately for the prosecution, their star witness was Grybkowski, who by this stage was a convicted felon. So that weakened their case, and after months of testimony, the Munich court wasn't really convinced about Ecclestone's criminality. And in a dramatic twist, in August 2014, the judge announced that the trial could be halted if Ecclestone agreed to a financial settlement. Of course, Bernie jumped at the chance. He ended up paying $100 million to end the case without admitting guilt. Now, to some people, the outcome, they were shocked by it. I mean, one of the richest men in sports had effectively bought his way out of a trial that could have not only ended his career, but seen him put in jail. But many in the paddocks, they weren't surprised. They were very familiar with how slippery Bernie was, how he was nearly always able to negotiate his way out of a tricky position and come out on top. So this was Bernie's MO. Now, under Bernie's leadership, it evolved from primarily a European competition into a worldwide spectacle. This is another key aspect of Bernie's leadership of Formula One. New markets became a priority, and he started opening up Formula One to new countries, hosting races in new countries, starting with Malaysia in 1999, then China in 2004, Bahrain also in 2004. This was the sport's first event in the Arab world, and soon the races were in countries all over the world like Turkey, Singapore, South Korea, India, Abu Dhabi. And these new destinations, they often came at the expense of traditional European circuits, which were struggling to meet Ecclestone's, very high financial demands. He just went for the countries that would give him the most money. But of course, in doing so, he also broadened Formula One's global footprint. And of course, the more Grand Prix you had in these countries all over the world, the more people were getting interested in it. And by 2008, the sport's cumulative global TV audience reached around 600 million per season. Now, financial analysts, they kind of marvelled at Formula One's economic model because nearly all of its revenue flowed through one man's hands. And an arrangement that kind of isn't replicated in any other elite sport. But, of course, not everyone prospered. I mean, several team owners struggled under the weight of escalating costs. An awful lot of the older teams like Tyrrell, Brabham, they all fell by the wayside. Ticket prices and hosting fees soared, and this put historic venues like Silverstone and Monza, these were often during these times on the brink of cancellation, and they were saved by last-minute compromises. Yes, by 2006, when CVC Capital entered the scene, Formula One was an undisputed business juggernaut. And the CVC era really cemented Bernie's position as one of Britain's wealthiest individuals. I mean, by 2013, Formula One's annual revenues were at 1.7 billion, profits exceeded 530 million. Ecclestone's own fortune was at over 4 billion. Despite this, people who knew him well said that his personal habits remained relatively frugal. He was more interested in the game of making money than in spending it. One journalist put it, "For Ecclestone, money is merely a way of keeping the score." You hear that a lot about billionaires, don't you? Anyway, CVC, while they were making loads of money, they also inherited a very fractured landscape because Ecclestone's leadership was hugely divisive and it created deep tensions. And by 2009, it erupted into open rebellion because teams were pissed with Bernie, with the way he controlled the sport. And they threatened to break away from Formula One because they were frustrated that they weren't getting their fair share of the booming TV and sponsorship revenues. Remember, I mentioned it before, the teams were receiving 47%. Now, by this stage, I think there's 10 teams in Formula One. I mean, I'm a big fan, you'd think I'd know that, but I think there was 10 teams. So they have to split the 47% between the 10 of them, 4.7% each. And I don't think they receive the same amount either. I think some of the bigger teams initially were getting more. But Bernie was getting 23% all for himself. Now, Bernie responded to this threat the way he always did. He played the divide and conquer game. He secretly struck deals with some of the bigger teams, giving them favourable terms and conditions, isolating the smaller teams, ultimately forcing them also to accept his terms. And, while he won this battle, the resentment lingered, and by the mid-2010s, Bernie himself, while still razor sharp, he was now well into his 80s. Teams were increasingly calling for change. Many were fed up with Bernie's control, his style of leadership, and also his business model. While hugely profitable, it was simple and old school. Sell TV rights, sponsorship deals, and race hosting fees to the highest bidders. But it was becoming clear, with the internet, social media, all the massive growth that was happening online, Bernie was out of touch. And his reluctance to embrace digital media, this became a big issue. Because Bernie dismissed efforts to expand Formula One's online presence. He argued that there was no clear way to monetize this. But of course, critics rightly accused him of prioritising short-term profits over long-term audience growth, because Formula One has this fantastic product that they could and should have been utilising to better effect to reach a larger audience. In effect, Bernie had grown the business as much as he could, but others could see that there was a huge opportunity to grow it even further. And in 2016, Liberty Media orchestrated an 8 billion takeover of Formula One's parent company. They bought out CVC for 8 billion, and this permanently changed the leadership. I mean, at first Ecclestone said that Liberty wanted him to stay on board, but that wasn't the truth. And in January 2017, he acknowledged the inevitable, and I quote, "I am simply gone, it's official, I am no longer the leader of the company." Now, Liberty did offer him a token role as chairman emeritus, I don't know how to pronounce that. But it was clear that his era was over. And Chase Carey, the new CEO, he explained why Liberty had moved on from Ecclestone's leadership. And I quote, "Over the past 4 or 5 years, the business had not grown to its full potential." And from Liberty's perspective, Ecclestone's outdated approach focused really, and I quote, on old rich white guys. And its fan base and commercial potential was underdeveloped. And in fairness, Liberty had been proven right. I mean, since taking over, they've introduced a cost cap, resulting in a more level playing field for the teams, which was crucial because there was a huge disparity between what the bigger teams were able to afford against the smaller teams. So that was crucial. They also put a huge focus on social media, targeting younger age group, and particularly in the USA. Then, of course, there was the massive success of Netflix Drive to Survive. They introduced the Las Vegas Grand Prix in 2023, and all of this has led to a huge surge of new fans and its increased revenue. The value of Liberty's stake in Formula One has more than doubled since they took over, and Formula One is now the most popular annual sporting series with over 750 million fans worldwide. Now, for Bernie, life hasn't been so good since stepping away from Formula One. First, there was this big case in 2022 where the UK Crown Prosecution Services charged him with fraud by false representation. They accused him of failing to declare over £400 million in overseas assets. Now, this case stemmed from Ecclestone's 2009 divorce from his second wife. Remember the 6'1" model I mentioned earlier on in the episode? Well, she divorced him in 2009 and got a $1.2 billion settlement. Now, as part of this settlement, Bernie was caught giving a misleading answer about a trust he controlled. Initially, he pleaded not guilty, but in October 2023, at 92 years old, he changed course. He pleaded guilty in a London court. He got a massive fine, £652 million. Poor Bernie's net worth, which was once over $4 billion, had dropped to $2.4 billion. And look, there's no denying that Ecclestone had a huge impact on Formula One. But his personality, I'm not a fan. I mean, here's a quote from him. He said, "If I had the choice of being loved or feared, I would rather be feared." And he was feared. And I'm just not a fan of anybody who runs their business through fear. Then there's also the record of where he took the sport. You know, he brought Formula One into countries with regimes that treat women as second-class citizens, criminalise homosexuality, and exploit migrant workers with little regard for their lives. I mean, some of these countries, you have migrant workers dying by their thousands. They are treated no better than slaves an awful lot of the time. I'm not a fan of that. And public statements over the years have sparked outrage. And you kind of question how somebody so brilliant in the boardroom could be so out of touch elsewhere. And let me give you an idea, and you can make up your own mind. He has this quote about Adolf Hitler that he made in 2009. Now, initially, I just read an excerpt from the quote, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to get the whole quote, and maybe it'll explain what Bernie was saying. But the whole quote makes Bernie look even worse. So this is the quote from Bernie about Hitler. Open quote. "Terrible to say this, I suppose, but apart from the fact that Hitler got taken away and persuaded to do things that I have no idea whether he wanted to do or not, he was, in the way that he could command a lot of people, able to get things done." Close quote. Okay, here's a quote from Bernie in 2005 about female drivers, and he said that female drivers should dress in white like all other domestic appliances. Close quote. Here's his take on racial injustice. So Lewis Hamilton, the only black driver in Formula One, he publicly spoke out about racial injustice. It's very close to his heart. And Ecclestone appeared baffled by Hamilton's reaction. And he said, open quotes, "I'm surprised that racism concerns him. And I'd be really unhappy if Hamilton took it seriously." Close quotes. And then instead of stopping there, he dug an even deeper hole by claiming, open quotes, "In many cases, black people are more racist than white people are." Now, we're talking about racial injustice here. I don't know where Ecclestone is coming from on this. And then, when Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, straight after he invaded it, Ecclestone appeared on TV, publicly defending the Russian president. He said, Putin is a first-class person and that I would take a bullet for him. So, at 94 years old at the time of this recording, Bernie remains a polarising figure. Look, there is no denying that he was one of the main architects of Formula One global success. He transformed it from this niche motorsport into this multi-billion-dollar spectacle and a sport that I love. But his legacy isn't just about the business triumphs. You got the bribery of a German banker, pleading guilty to fraud in a London courtroom, praising dictators, belittling women and minorities. Look, whether Bernie likes it or not, these moments are part of his story too, and they'll shape how history will remember him. But I suppose that's what makes Bernie and the story of Formula One such a great business story. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. And remember, if you have any comments, any corrections, or any story that you'd like us to cover, email us at info@gbspod.com. All the best, folks.